So let's now take a look at passing our selected activity into our form, or if we don't have an activity, we're creating an activity, so we want to initialize our form with basically an empty activity. So let's head back to VS Code and take a look at what we need to do to achieve this. So in our activity dashboard, what we need to do is also pass down our activity to our activity form. So I'm just going to copy this line and paste it into our activity form and just reformat. And once again, we get our standard error telling us that we haven't added this to our activity form props yet. So let's go to our activity form and we'll add our activity as type of iActivity. And this activity is going to represent our initial form state for our activity form. So let's pass it into our destructured props and I'll say activity. Now what we want to do here is initialize our form in some way with either this activity, or if we don't have an activity, then we want to create the structure for our form. And what we want to do here is I'm just going to create a function called initialize form, and it's going to take no parameters, and what we'll do is we'll say if activity, then what we'll return is the activity. And if we don't have an activity, then what we want to return is an object that contains the fields in our form. So we'll have a title, which is going to be just an empty string. We'll have a category, again, and just an empty string. The description, the dates, the city, and the venue. And what we can do is we can pass this initialize form function as the initial parameter to a useState hook. And what we'll do is we'll just bring in useState from React. And below our initialize form, and I'll just reformat, and below the initialize form, what we'll do is we'll say const activity and set activity equals useState, and then we'll say initialize form. And we're getting some errors here because we've got a duplicate identifier of activity. And what I'll do is I'll just rename this activity here and just call it by a different name. And I'll just call this activity initial form state instead of activity. And then I can pass this down to our if statement here. And what we also want to do is specify the type in our useState as well, and this is going to be iActivity. And this gives us an error. And the reason this gives us an error is that the new object that we're creating here, if we don't have an activity, we're creating a new object with 6 properties, all as strings. And this doesn't match our activity interface because we're missing the ID field, and also we've set the date to a string, as a string. Now what we're getting back from ASP.NET Core just now is we're getting our dates back as strings, as ISO strings. So what we'll do temporarily is we'll change our activity model or our activity interface, and instead of our date being a date, we're just going to set this to a string. And what we'll also do back in our activity form is just to match the structure of an activity, we'll also give our initial form state an ID just as an empty string, so that we get around the typing error that we're getting there. Now we're not going to let users complete the ID property inside the form, but we will be creating the ID on the client side as a GUID. So creating this empty activity as this is not a major issue. Now what we also want to do is add the activity properties as values inside our form. So let's just go ahead and say value equals activity.title, filler title. We'll say value equals activity.description, filler description. Same for the category. Same for the dates. So value equals activity.dates. And then we'll do the same for the city. Activity.city. And then just the same for the venue as well. And what we should find now is that when we go to edit an activity, we're going to see the properties of the activity inside our form. And of course we've got an error because we've got a typing issue. And it's telling us that type null is not assignable to type activity. So if we take a look at where this is coming from our activity dashboard, and it's because we're passing our activity down to our activity form. And we've got no guarantee that we're going to have an activity to pass down to our activity form. But what we can't do is do what we did with our activity details, which is only display the activity details component if we actually have a selected activity. So what we need to do to get around this particular problem is introduce back our exclamation mark, and we're effectively telling TypeScript that we know what we're doing here. We're quite okay with sending down null for our selected activity because we have a conditional inside our form that checks to see if our activity is null, and if it is, it takes a different action. So adding this exclamation mark here bypasses this particular warning from TypeScript, and if we go back to our application, we can now see it's working again. So if I click on to view past activity 1 and I click on edit, I can see my properties being populated in this particular form. Now the date's not displaying at the moment, but we'll deal with that shortly. But what we want to look at next is forms in React, because if I try and type into any of these fields, then what's happening is these fields are all currently read only. And we'll take a look at why that is and what we need to do to resolve that. And what we're effectively talking about here is forms in React and control components. And we'll take a look at that next.